Hello, 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 hello. I welcome you to our second episode of the Itihas podcast. Now, let's pick up from where we left off in the last episode. We did discuss about the formation of Earth in how it coalesced from different particles that were floating around in our proto solar system, and how gravity helped a little bit into forming that little ball of magma, and then how there was this period of multiple asteroid impacts throughout millions of years, which brought about the elements that are essential for what we are about to discuss, which is the formation of life. And also, let's not forget that the Hadean eon is so early in the evolutionary stage of our planet that for us to get direct evidences from this eon becomes very difficult. In fact, those evidences are so scarce that most of our knowledge of this eon comes from us sort of projecting, making models and experimentations about what would have happened or what could have happened that led to where we are today. It's almost like backtracking from the solution to create the problem that occurred. And what I mean by this is that, yes, we do know that there was a big protoplanet called Theia that impacted onto Earth, which went on to become the moon, the resultant effect of it. But what we don't know is the small nuances of, let's say, how Theia's final trajectory would have been after the impact or before the impact, or what time period it took for Earth to cool down or for it to develop into what we see today. So yeah, there are a lot of places where things get a little murky. But as we go through this geological timescale and come more and more towards present time, the evidences slowly start to show up and the story becomes much better. So here we are. In the last episode, we spoke about how there are different eons that we have divided the Earth's geological timescale, and most of these eons are based on, or the cutoff point of these eons are based on some huge event happening or defining the forthcoming eon, right? We did speak about the Hadean as well as the Archean eon, and we saw how slowly the Earth began to cool down, and from being that giant ball of magma, it slowly became a little more habitable per se. But then, one of the coolest things to imagine during this time period is the fact that the infant Earth, at the age of about 500 million years, gave little hint as to how amazing it was going to be. Because, see, the things that you see on Earth during this time period are not unique. Earth was graced by global spanning oceans, but so was Mars in those early days, while Jupiter's giant moons like Europa or Callisto were enveloped by ice-covered oceans more than 50 miles deep, thus holding far greater proportions of the this amazing life-giving liquid on the surface that we see on Earth. Similarly, plate tectonics that gave birth to continents was nothing unique to Earth itself. Plate tectonics helped transform our planet just as it did for Venus and possibly Mars, who had their own versions of this convection-driven tectonics. And similarly, nor was the chemistry of Earth that different, because basalt and granite were foundation stones for all the other rocky planets. Similarly, if you look at oxygen, silicon, aluminum, magnesium, calcium, and iron, which dominated their composition, the same thing is true for all the other rocky planets. Earth had its share of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur, but other worlds in our solar system were equally endowed with these vital elements. So, why? How did Earth become that unique planet? And what we're talking about here. We're talking about the most dynamic engine of planetary change which set Earth apart. The creation of the biosphere, the creation and evolution of life on Earth. And for us to understand this whole idea of life, we should also start by defining what life is. And I feel like this is a very, very fascinating question to ask yourself, because whatever parameters you try to define around life, for example, a really good definition would be a complex structure coupled with the ability to move, grow, to adapt, and to reproduce, right? And it almost covers everything, but there are a lot of living things that don't move, and there are quite a few living things that don't reproduce the way we think reproduction works. I mean, if you go ahead and start asking from a fifth grader to, let's say, a person who specializes in life science and biology, the definition of life would dramatically change, right? And that's why if we try to define life, we would find it a lot easier for chemistry to sort of help us. And the reason why I turn towards chemistry is very simple. Chemistry boils down this whole definition into its most basic form. Here, we're not talking about movement or growing or adaptations. Here, we're talking about something which is completely essential for life's own self-preservation. And these two things which are necessary for life to continue are to have a controlled state of metabolism and to have a way to ensure that it is able to transfer its own genetic material as time goes by. So, metabolism and genetics together they distinguish living from the non-living. And here, again, metabolism is a varied suite of chemical reactions that all life forms use to convert atoms and energy from their surroundings into more of their cell stuff. And the reason why I say metabolism is so important is because when you look into this whole story of creation of life, the whole story of formation of life, you always start with that very small single cell, that small amino acid coated in fat layer, which started producing energy for itself. And that energy producing chemical reaction is what gave it metabolism. And then the second part of it is genetics, because metabolism alone isn't enough to define life. Unlike their non-living environments, cells carry information in the form of DNA molecules, and they can copy and pass that molecular information from one generation to the next. What's more is that the information itself can change, it can mutate. Molecules that are copied from generation to generation are often copied with errors, which provide them chemical novelty and innovations that enables a particular population of that gene pool to do better than the rest of the population. Now, obviously, this is a little more complicated and it goes a little deeper into genetic science, and this is something that we will pick up when we talk about evolution in general. But this evolution, this whole idea of mutation in genes, was very, very necessary for the next stage of life to happen. Remember when we spoke about in the last episode where there were certain chemical eating cells which were producing energy through consumption of chemicals, and yet there was a certain mutation that happened in them which helped those cells to go ahead to use sunlight. And this was nothing but a mutation that happened in the countless production of copies of that particular cell that was eating chemicals. So this mutation becomes very, very important for life to flourish the way it does. So we can sort of conclude that metabolism and genetics together categorize living matter. And to that effect, when the whole world was sort of searching for a particular definition of what is living, because let's not forget, we have been looking towards the stars every night, sort of imagining if there is life out there. And for that, we needed to define what life would be. And there was this NASA panel which was chaired by Gerald Joyce of the Scripps Research Institute, which agreed on a streamlined sentence. And they said that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. So there you go. It encompasses both the idea of evolution, mutation, genetics, as well as self-sustaining chemical system, which encompasses the idea of metabolism. So yeah, that sort of gives us an idea about what life could be. Now, keeping this in mind, let's try to see what happens as we start transitioning from the Archean aeon and going towards the Proterozoic aeon. Now, in the last episode, we did briefly mention about the formation of life during the Archean aeon, and we used this terminology known as the primordial soup. Now, let's take a deeper look into this whole idea of the primordial soup. See, during this time period, Earth had almost all the necessary essential materials for life to flourish. We've already spoken about how metabolism was one of those first and foremost things for life to occur. And for that, Earth had its own fair share of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Similarly, metabolism needs energy, and that energy was available aplenty on Earth. You had the sun, which was giving us free radiation throughout. You had Earth's own inner heat, which was trapped throughout the Earth's surface, distributed throughout the Earth's surface. You also had occasional lightnings and asteroid impacts, and let's not forget there were a lot of radioactive elements which were also present, which had their own energy to radiate. So energy and chemical compositions, everything was there for our taking. And one point that everyone agrees with is the fact that carbon, which was the most versatile element in our periodic table, did play a very pivotal role towards this. The carbon we have spoken about is an element which can form long chains of atoms or interlocked rings or complex branching arrangements and almost any other imaginable shape. And that is the reason why the backbone of proteins like carbohydrates, fats, and oils, of DNA, RNA, everything is based on carbon. So, and carbon was again available aplenty. So, given that everything was available, what happened? What really happened, right? And the idea towards this, for us to understand what really happened, we first have to take a look at the basic life molecules, the biogenesis through these basic life molecules, the sugars, the amino acids, the lipids, and everything, and how it interacted with each other. Now, modern origin of life research began in 1953 in what remains to this day the most famous experiment, biogenesis. Chemist Harold Urey, a Nobel Prize-winning professor at the University of Chicago, and his graduate student Stanley Miller, they designed a very simple and elegant tabletop glass apparatus to simulate the early Earth. They gently boiled the water and water peroxides that were present to imitate the Hadean aeon, and at the same time they put in a mixture of simple gases which mimicked the Earth's proto-atmosphere, and occasionally passed electric sparks into it to simulate lightning. After a few days, this confined colorless water turned pink, then it turned brown, and with a complex mix of organic molecules, it slowly became this black organic sludge. And this whole experiment is what we came to associate with this whole primordial soup. So that's why we started calling this a primordial soup experiment. Now, this particular thing that happened in the 1950s was so groundbreaking and so interesting that when Miller and Urey, they finally published their paper in 1953 in the journal Science, you had chemists all over the world come into this to make this whole primordial soup and recreate this experiments with different variations, and all of this, by the end of it, made it that it established beyond any doubt that early Earth must have been full of this life essential molecules formed by the lightning and the chemicals and the atmosphere that was there. But this initial enthusiasm around this whole primordial soup experiment had also a sort of a negative effect on our understanding, especially our initial understanding on the origin of life. What this experiment did was it really concentrated people's efforts into recreating this particular version of the experiment where lightning, chemicals, and the atmosphere was creating life. And a lot of this was also later on replicated with the use of UV rays to simulate the sun. And what it did was it made sure that the conversation around the formation of life or creation of life would only evolve around either the sun radiating and giving energy, or electricity or sparks or lightning providing this energy for life to be created, which meant that life could only be created close to the surface of Earth. Now, the problem with this understanding is the fact that there was still another source of energy that was inside the Earth, the intense heat that was being generated inside Earth. And again, there were a lot of complexities that were completely ignored when they sort of limited themselves to this whole primordial soup experiment. See, a few experimentalists of the 1950s considered the staggering complexities of the natural geochemical environments and altered as they were by daily cycles, for example, the night and day cycle, or the hot and cold, or the wet and dry, and more. And none of this was taken into consideration, nor did they consider the range of natural gradients in temperature, for example, as volcanic magma contacts cold ocean water, or in salinity as fresh streams enter the salty ocean. So none of this was being considered. And again, they never considered the fact that there are vents deep inside oceans which are spewing a lot of chemicals inside the ocean from the Earth's crust. And this is where things started to become a little difficult, because when later experimentations were being done, because this whole idea of primordial soup continued for the next 30 years. So next 3 decades, the whole creation of life was evolved around this whole idea. And it was only in the 1980s when finally there were experiments being done which went beyond these Millerites, quote unquote, and they started to discover the deep sea black smoker ecosystem, which was a viable alternative to the primordial soup. What I mean by this is that in those deep dark zones far from the sunlit ocean surface, mineral-rich fluids interact with hot volcanic crust to generate ocean floor geyser-like vents. Jets of scalding water contact that frigid or deep ocean to create a constant precipitation of minerals, and life abound in those astounding hidden places, fueled by chemical energy at the interface between the crust and the ocean. Now, this is why it was important for us to discuss this, because when we spoke earlier about the formation of life, we said that how there were a lot of living cells which were creating their life out of chemical energy, and then there was an exception to this rule where there were cells which developed a mechanism of using sunlight. So now we have this idea clear to us that the whole primordial soup experiment, which only concentrated on these very few factors that Miller and Urey used in their experiment, were not the only components that were essential for life. And the conclusion of this little discussion is the fact that by that time period, during the merge zone of Hadean and Archean era, Archean eon, we reach a period where the components of life, all the brick and mortar of life, are already present. Now, from this point onwards, there is going to be a selection that is going to happen for the next part of Earth to occur. Also, the idea that life can form beyond sun-drenched surface of a watery world has opened a lot of possibilities for us, because now the idea that life can emerge from black, hot depths of subsurface volcanic zones, then it adds many celestial bodies into the tempting targets for exploration for life. Mars today must have deep hydrothermal zones, perhaps endures life there even today. Or maybe there are several Jupiter moons which also could be ripe for biological investigation, as is Saturn's organic-rich Earth-sized moon Titan. Even some of the larger asteroids may have deep life-producing hot wet zones. And if that's the case, then yeah, the whole idea that life can exist beyond Earth becomes much more viable. Now, after the creation of these biomolecules, the next step in the process of evolution must have been the concentration of these into formation of macromolecules, to the membranes that encloses the cell, the enzymes that promotes its chemical reactions, and the genetic polymers that pass information from one generation to the next. And without going too much into details of biochemistry, let's just say that there were two processes which were essential for this to happen. One was the formation of, was the group of lipids which clump together spontaneously to form membranes that encapsulates the first cells. And the second was the template-directed synthesis, which basically means that amino acid sugars and components of DNA and RNA adsorbed onto all Earth's most common rock-forming minerals. They basically mean that many of life's most vital molecular building blocks stick to virtually any natural mineral surface. So with the lipids forming membranes and these amino acids sticking to minerals, all of this combined slowly started creating those complex macromolecules of life. Now, from this point onwards, something big needed to happen. We had metabolism, we have our cells, we have these macromolecules. What we needed from this point onwards was the multiplication of itself, which is what genetics was covering, right? Replication, in simple terms. Array of these chemicals, no matter how intricately patterned, are not alive unless they can make copies of themselves. And that is what life's most distinctive hallmark is, which is reproduction. And don't think of this reproduction as a very natural step to everything that was happening. During this time period, let's look at Earth. Earth during the 4 billion years ago to the 2.5 billion years ago mark, the whole period from the Hadean towards Archean. This time period is a time period where there is a broth of organic molecules available already. You have trillions upon trillions of reactive mineral surfaces where template-directed synthesis can happen. And then at the same time, you have hundreds and millions of years for these experiments to go on. And most of these experiments would probably yield nothing, right? But there would be a small fraction of organic molecules arrayed on a mineral surface produce some kind of a structure with enhanced function. Perhaps they had a stronger surface attachment, or maybe the means to attract more molecules to the community, or the tendency to catalyze their own ability to make copies of itself. But why would random molecules want to make copies of itself, right? Isn't that a big question for us? And the answer is not very complex. See, imagine a time period where you had hundreds and thousands of different molecules, all made of carbon and hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and maybe with some of sulfur thrown in there. They would display a degree of molecular variation in themselves. Some would have more carbon, some would have less carbon, some would have more hydrogen, some would have less oxygen. And not all molecules were going to react the same way. Some would be completely unstable and would decompose and nothing would happen with them. Some would start attaching to each other without any further formations of complex organic compounds and would just sink into the depths of the magma ocean or the hot boiling ocean. But there would be some molecules which would prove to be stable enough to attract other molecules of the same kind, attached to a really nice molecular surface and survive and go on. Now, imagine this process being repeated again and again, where slowly those materials or molecules which were not efficient in doing this would be discarded, and the molecular broth which would survive on this tempting mineral surface would go on further. And this process is just the whole definition of what we see in genetics. Nothing but variation and selection. Variation in the types of composition of molecules present in each of these complex molecular structures, and selection of those which would actually survive. And that's what happens. Molecular interactions further refined this prebiotic mix that we had, and some group of molecules cooperatively stuck to the mineral surface, thus enhancing survival of this particular type, and other small molecules acted as catalysts, enhancing some chemical species by promoting formation of chemical bonds, or speeding up the destruction of other chemical species by breaking chemical bonds. So all in all, what was happening during this time period is a lot of experimentation was happening, and slowly we were creating that very amazingly engineered form of life that would be self-sustaining itself, that will be able to make copies of itself, and that would go on to create life, right? Now, I do apologize if this discussion is becoming a little more geared towards biochemistry, but for us, this understanding is a little bit more important, because at the end of the day, the life that comes out of it, you and me who sit here today, were nothing but these puddles of chemicals that slowly came together and formed us. Now, there's this one small part that we still haven't discussed, which is how and what process were they using to replicate themselves. And when we talk about replication in genetics, the next logical connection between them would be the mention of DNA. And it is true that modern cells use the lateral-like molecule DNA to store and copy the information needed to make more proteins. But at the same time, they use complex folded protein molecules to make the DNA. So what came first, DNA or protein? And the answer of this is actually a third molecule, the third kind, which is known as the RNA, which plays a central role in both the processes. And this is the RNA, the elegant polymer, a long single-stranded molecule assembled from smaller individual molecules, which plays a really big role in the whole idea of how these cells were replicating in this whole the whole Archean eon. And the reason why this discussion becomes important to us is because it was this RNA which coded the genetic material that helped these cells to further make copies of itself, to allow those mutations that we spoke about, to allow those selection processes we spoke about, which would finally result towards the explosion of life that we see right at the end of the Archean eon. And from this point onwards is where evolution will start playing a huge role. You would see that a self-replicating molecule with its own RNA ensured its own survival by producing more or less identical daughters. But obviously there are going to be different mutations that would occur, because this whole process is inevitably very messy. The whole idea of RNA copying each other are not completely perfect in nature, and mutations would occur. And while most of these mutations were lethal, some of them did confer some sort of advantage over their own parents. If the parents were able to, let's say, survive at a particular temperature range, some mutations occurred which increased that temperature range. If the parents were able to multiply at a particular rate, some mutations occurred where the daughters were able to reproduce at a much faster rate. And that's what happened. A whole system evolved. Everything from these chance copying errors in this copying of RNA started producing variants which were either more tolerant to heat, pressure, salt, or replicated faster, found new sources of food, or destroyed their less fit neighbors. And this process is what slowly gave rise to that particular cell that somehow started using sunlight instead of using chemicals for production of its own energy. Now, me saying that slowly, if it gave rise to that part of life, this whole slowly is a little hard to imagine when we talk about small molecules and these small molecules slowly engulfing the whole of Earth. But then imagine this. You have a small molecule, and obviously Earth is in a very nutrient-rich zone where none of these chemicals have to compete with each other. These molecules have to compete with each other. So Imagine a situation where this one cell, single cell, it starts replicating, and it replicates in a week or so. In a week, it becomes 2. So in the next week, it will become 4, and so on and so forth. So it would take about half a year for it to become this one small replicating cell to become 100 million self-replicating molecules, which would be the size of something that we can see from the naked eye, and then another 20 weeks for it to become as big as a thumbnail. But if this rate continues, in the next 20 weeks or so, this would become the size of a small bucket or a small bathtub. And continuing to double every week, it would quickly produce a remarkable transformation. 20 more weeks and we would see miles of this RNA-infused molecule water, and then perhaps along the coast of an inland lake or a deep sea environment, and within 2 years, assuming the single initial RNA strand doubled every week, Earth could boast as much as 1 million cubic kilometers of living stuff, enough to clog the entire Mediterranean Ocean. So we are talking here about millions of years. So you can already imagine that this primitive single-celled organism would feed on the energy available and would multiply and fill up the earth completely, right? Now, it is difficult for us to pinpoint exactly when this whole thing would have happened, exactly when life would have formed on Earth. A few of Earth's most ancient sedimentary rocks, those laid down in the shallow ocean environments about, let's say, 3.5 billion years ago, hold unmistakably microbial fossils. They have these dome-like rocky stromatolites, a few inches to a few feet across, formed where colonies of cells precipitated thin layers upon layers of minerals in shallow settings. And similarly, you would find some fossils which have been found and bioelements from intensely altered rocks, which are about 3.85 billion years old, but by no means have they convinced the geological community that that's when the life would have started. So it's a little difficult for us to exactly pinpoint when life would have started, but whenever first life emerged, whether before 4.4 billion years or after 3.5 billion years ago, the fact remains that it little altered Earth's ancient surface. Those earliest microbes simply learned chemical tricks that Earth already knew. From our planet's earliest days, chemical reactions have taken place at or near its solid surface. The reason boils down to the distribution of electrons. Earth's mantle has on average more electrons per atom than the crust. So the mantle is more reduced and the surface more oxidized in the whole idea of chemistry. Now, when reduced and oxidized chemicals meet, for example, when reduced magma and gases from the mantle breach the more oxidized surface in the volcanic eruptions, they often undergo in a chemical reactions where electrons are transferred from the former to the latter. And rusting, in which iron reacts with oxygen, is a similar process. Now, iron metal is fully packed of electrons, so many electrons, you will recall that some of them are free to wander through the shiny metal and conduct electricity. And that is the reason why iron is usually seen as a really good conductor. Oxygen gas, on the other hand, is so starved for electrons that a pair of oxygen atoms must pool together their resources to form the oxygen molecule, which is an O2 molecule, in which the meager supply of electrons is shared by both the atoms, like rationing in a deserted island per se. So you can already see that this whole idea of oxidation and reduction or the flow of electrons is something that was always needed. It's a process that has always been there on Earth, and that is what was happening with these molecules, with these living molecules as well. And just as oxygen did with iron, oxygen was readily available to go ahead and react with all the other compounds and started making sulfates, nitrates, carbonates, and phosphates. So this whole idea of oxygen being electron starved and what is essentially we know as the reduction oxidation reaction was happening all throughout Earth. And even before life emerged, this reaction was taking place at a very leisurely pace. But then when the first microbes arrived, they learned to shuffle the electrons at an accelerated rate. In many places, be it these primitive coastlines or the near surface waters or the ocean floors, you would find that these living cells became the mediators of these reactions. Communities over communities of these microbes made their livelihood by speeding up this reaction rate and then using that resultant energy to create their own life forces to grow, to reproduce. And what happens from this point onwards is that Earth had made iron oxides from the start. But now these microbes have accelerated it to a point where if you start looking at these massive archean banded formations across Australia, South America and other ancient terrains, you find that they were readily oxidizing the iron which was dissolved in the Hadean and Archean oceans at a very, very fast increasing rate, right? It's the same example that we spoke about, how small microbes can evolve and can replicate at such a high level. So when you look at tens of millions of years of time period, you see that yes, this whole usage of these microbes accelerating this reaction have now started an interaction between the geosphere and the biosphere to a point where they will start quote-unquote terraforming the earth itself. See, if you look at it this way, evolution by natural selection continued to drive all the processes. A microbe species that learned to use its iron food source more efficiently, or to tolerate more extreme conditions, or to exploit new reduction oxidation reactions, had a distinct advantage and ensured its own survival over those who couldn't, right? Because again, like we spoke about previously, how metabolism and genetics was important, and genetics was basically trying to replicate itself. Those which would replicate themselves better through natural selections would survive better. And then consequently, mutating populations of microbes invented new catalysts that promoted these energy-producing reactions more efficiently than other non-living environments. The result here and there were little mounds of limestones and modest deposits of iron oxides, along with a gradual increase in the process of near-surface carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus reactions. So, nevertheless, life started flourishing during this point, and this is where I take you to what we have been talking about since the very beginning of this podcast and hinting it here and there, the whole usage of light, right? Now, most origin researchers suspect that earliest life forms relied exclusively on chemical energy of rocks, an abundant source to be sure, but one that greatly restricted where life could thrive. At some point, a few microbes moved beyond their role as mediators of chemical reactions intrinsic to their environment. They learned to collect solar radiation, which would prove an abundant, cheap energy source for any surface dweller anywhere on the planet. So, in its most basic form, this is what photosynthesis was, right? Photosynthesis uses sunlight to make biochemicals from such ubiquitous raw materials like carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water. Given the right chemical scaffolding, all the life's essential building blocks, amino acids, sugars, lipids, and components of DNA, RNA can be made from this atmospheric gases and sun's radiation. And unlike modern green algae, those first microbial photosynthesizers generated no oxygen. Indeed, modern analogues of these primitive organisms tend to form a brownish purplish scum on stagnant ponds. Some biologists have even suggested that the immense floating rafts of photosynthetic microbes discolored the blue Archean Ocean with unsightingly brownish and purple splotches. And this is happening why? Because sunlight is available in such abundance that there is no hindrance to the reproduction. In fact, these microbes, through the process of mutation, would start creating even more efficient users of sunlight. Now, let's not forget, during this time period, even those photosynthesizing microbes were not exhaling oxygen. During this time period, and even in the next 1 billion years or so, you would find that Earth's microbial life would gently nudge near-surface environments, first by spreading along this whole reduction oxidation reaction, and then through photosynthesis. But over the next 1.5 billion years, these photosynthesizing microbes would learn a new chemical trick to exhale the highly reactive, dangerously corrosive oxygen gas. Now, during this time period, like we said, just to do a small recap, we have our first microbes which are which are acting like catalysts between the oxygen that is available and the iron that is available, and is creating hematite, through which a large amount of energy is being produced, which is then being used by these microbes to further grow and reproduce. Now, the same reaction is happening with other elements also, be it iron, nickel, or whatever chemicals that these microbes can use. And the first steps into photosynthesis have also been taking place during this time period, but we don't really have oxygen coming out as a byproduct from this. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you follow it. I usually forget to plug in the call to action because, when we are in a discussion like this, it tends to take over my excitement. But yeah, if you're liking this, make sure you go ahead and follow and share with people who you think would enjoy our discussions on this. Now, something has to change, right? Something has to change for Earth to become where we are during our present day, where we have such a rich amount of oxygen present in the environment, and that something needs to occur during this time period. We are now about to cross the threshold from the Archean towards the Proterozoic, and crossing that threshold becomes important for us because, like I said, these eons are marked by big events, right? The date and how the geological timescale has been divided. Every time we are about to cross over to a new period or a new eon or an era or an epoch, something big happens, and that something big which we are about to encounter is what we know as the Great Oxygenation Event. Now, let's pave our path towards this Great Oxygenation Event. And the reason why we call this the Great Oxygenation Event is because the transformation of both the geosphere and the biosphere was so huge and so strikingly defined that it did mark a huge change in how the Earth was before and after. See, the Earth's surface changed from a dull grey to a brick red in almost a geological afternoon in a period of millions of years, with innovation of oxygen producing photosynthesis and the consequent rise of an oxidizing atmosphere. Now, this intriguing story of Earth's initial oxygenation is only now coming into foray because we have started looking into evidences that sort of tell us about the pre and post differences during this whole oxygenation event. Evidence for this great oxidation event also comes from the growing catalogue of the observation of rocks and minerals that date from the vast chunk of Earth's history. Because if we put the great oxidation event around that 2.5 billion years ago mark, and we start looking at rocks before and after, we do find that on one hand, many rocks older than 2.5 billion years contain minerals that are easily destroyed by corrosive effects of oxygen, suggesting an oxygen-free environment prior to that time. And for example, geologists find unweathered rounded pebbles of pyrite and uranite in ancient steam beds, places where such minerals would quickly erode and break down in today's oxygen-rich surface environment. And such ancient sandy layers have this telltale chemistry which is unusually concentrated in oxygen-avoiding elements such as cerium, while strikingly deficient in other compounds like iron, which you find in today's soil. And by that contrast, if you look at rocks younger than 2.5 billion years, they contain many unambiguous signs of oxygen. So between that 2.5 and 1.8 billion years ago, you find these massive deposits of iron oxides called banded iron formations, which were deposited in staggering abundance. These distinctive dense accumulation of altering black and rusty red layers hold 90% of the world's known iron ore reserves that we use today. So, manganese oxides also suddenly appears as thickly stratified deposits that now provide the world's chief repositories of manganese ores. Hundreds of other new minerals, oxidized ores of copper, nickel, uranium, and more also appear in these rock records for the first time after this great oxygenation event. And if I ask you now, where did all of this oxygen come from? The answer for you would be very simple. We know about photosynthesis. We've always known about photosynthesis. So any photosynthesizing bacteria during this time period, let's call them cyanobacteria, they must have used up the whole pathways of photosynthesis, where they use the carbon dioxide that was already readily available, the water that was readily available, use sunlight, and then produced what we know as the photosynthetic reaction, right? We know that in photosynthesis, plants consume 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water to make 1 molecule of sugar glucose with 6 molecules of oxygen as their byproduct. But during this time period, there were a lot of bacteria which were not just using photosynthesis the way we know it, because we know right now the pigment called chlorophyll, which is present in plant, which absorbs light in red and violet wavelengths, but throughout Earth's history, a variety of cells have employed other photosynthetic pathways that produce no oxygen at all. Alternative light-absorbing pigments have evolved to decorate red and brown algae, purple bacteria, and strikingly beautiful diatoms and lichens in wide range of colors. In fact, there are few which we know of which were capable of using infrared radiations, wavelengths which are utterly invisible to our eyes and which we feel as heat a lot of times. So, photosynthesis was a complex process, and this complex process did result towards this oxidation event. But there's another really cool thing to observe here. Earth would have experienced oxidation by itself even without photosynthesis, because what was happening before this great oxygenation event is that every time a water vapor would escape towards the Earth's atmosphere, the harsh radiations coming from the sun would break the H2O molecule into H2 and O2, and oftentimes the energy from these radiations would make ozone as well, O3s, and given that O2 and O3s are heavier, they would still be pulled by the Earth's gravity, whereas this H2 would gradually escape out of the Earth's atmosphere. And this process did occur. We did lose a lot of hydrogen molecules to this process. And this process itself is not unique to Earth. You would find that Mars, which is much smaller as compared to Earth, and consequently has weaker gravity compared to Earth, has lost most of its hydrogen through this process itself. So in that last 4.5 billion years or so, most of its near surface hydrogen was lost, and while these iron minerals near the surface stayed back, and that is the reason why Mars has its signature red color. Now, the reason why we're talking about this is because there was a time period when the great oxidation event or great oxygenation event was being refuted by a lot of laureates in the scientific world, but then they were proven wrong as we discovered the great joys of spectrometry, and by the 1980s and 1990s we were able to closely inspect a lot of elements on Earth's surface, out of which the sulfur isotopes were very, very useful for us to prove it. I'm not going to go into the details of it because again, that's a really cool conversation, but it slowly takes away from our historical discussion and goes more towards geology. But yes, the great oxidation event did happen, but oxidation on Earth would have happened even without it. It's just that the great oxidation event marks a period where it was amplified by many, many more times. Okay, so the stage is set. We know that the great oxidation event happens. Now, what is this great oxidation event exactly that we've been mentioning for such a long time? Now, let's piece in all our puzzles together. We know that during this time period, right before 2.5 billion years ago, most of the microbial life which was present at this point was anoxic in nature or anaerobic in nature. They were not using oxygen for their own production of energy. What they were using were compounds of irons and sulfides. So given that most of the Earth and most of these life forms were existing in these pools of water which was rich in reduced iron, life was great. But there comes a point where through multiple mutations and evolution comes a cyanobacteria, which now has the ability to photosynthesize. Now, we did have phytobacteria before, which were able to use light, but they were not really producing oxygen as a byproduct. But this particular cyanobacteria that comes through the main stage, comes at a point where it can use carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water to create oxygen as a byproduct. Now, these cyanobacteria, as time goes on, are able to use this abundant supply of energy that is there which is coming to us every day from the sun. Now, there is no competition, there is nothing else here, because these guys are now above those chemotrophic microbes. So we reach a stage where these cyanobacteria start to flourish. And flourish they do, oh boy. They start flourishing to a point where slowly, they increase in population, and this increase in population is so drastic that the photosynthesizing cyanobacteria start using up all the carbon dioxide that is present in the environment and producing large amounts of oxygen. Now, this is great for you who is using oxygen as their source of food, but as we know, most of the microorganisms during this time period were anaerobic in nature. So as we have oxygen being pumped into the atmosphere, pumped into the ocean waters, it starts reacting with the reduced iron that is available. It starts forming rust. The color of the whole Earth's ocean is going to slowly turn into that red ball that we spoke about. And then comes a time period where the oceans are so saturated with oxygen that they start pushing oxygen into the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere now slowly getting concentrated in oxygen, and the carbon dioxide being used by these photosynthesizing cyanobacteria is about to have a very big drastic effect in the whole geosphere. What happens here is that as carbon dioxide is being consumed by these cyanobacteria, and as you and I know that carbon dioxide itself is a greenhouse gas, a gas which helps regulate the temperature on Earth's surface as it goes away, the temperature of the Earth's surface starts falling down. Now, most of the oxygen that was being produced by the saturated ocean of cyanobacteria and starts going into the atmosphere also starts reacting with the atmospheric methane that was available. Again, the methane reaction goes ahead, breaks down into compounds of water, oxygen, and the methane also starts completely disappearing from the atmosphere. So if the methane and carbon dioxide disappears, what happens? You slowly have no heat being concentrated on the Earth's surface, and the Earth reaches a point of glaciation. And the reason why we call this the Great Oxidation Event is because, as you can see, such huge changes are happening to the both biosphere as well as the geosphere. In terms of the biosphere, you would see that most of the anaerobic organisms would now die out, because the sources that they depended on are now completely being washed up and completely being saturated by these oxygen producing cyanobacteria, and then reaches a point where the cyanobacteria themselves will start dying off, because the carbon dioxide that was present in the atmosphere is now being depleted by the sudden increase in the population of the cyanobacteria. So as a result, what happens is this great oxidation event causes what we know as the Huronian glaciation period, which is a glaciation period that lasts for about 200 to 300 million years. Now, all in all, if you look at the Great Oxidation Event, you would also see this as the very first mass extinction event, where a lot of life form now completely goes away, and at the same time, the very first glaciation event, because of which a large fall in the average temperature of Earth occurs. Now, given that you and I are still here, this wasn't the end of the story of Earth, right? And as we start going towards the Proterozoic era, as we start moving towards the end of the Huronian glaciation period, as the Earth starts to warm up a little bit, we have something that we did not have before, an atmosphere which was so concentrated on oxygen, which was being bombarded by the radiation from the sun, which ended up creating ozone, and for the first time we have an ozone layer. And then any of the surviving cyanobacterial species or of the complex photosynthesizing species that ended up living post this glaciation period will now pave way to more complex life forms, and that's where we'll pick up our next episode. So again, this was our discussion on how we reached the Great Oxidation Event. I hope you liked it. If it was too technical, let me know in the comments down below, or you can reach out to me directly through my Telegram channel or mail me directly, the mail ID of which will be provided in the description of the episode itself. Any of the sources being used in this podcast will also be mentioned in the description itself. Again, you're listening to me. My name is Arnapati. I hope you like this. The podcast is called Itihas. And as we go through this whole evolution of Earth, we'll slowly reach the period of dinosaurs, which we all are very excited about. And so on and so forth, we'll reach the whole Darwinian evolution theory of how chimpanzees became human. So again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like the podcast, make sure you go ahead and follow it and share it with any of your friends who you think would find this to be really cool. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.